going to do exactly what a couple of your previous speakers have done in terms of saying to understand clothing of the 1880s, we really have to start at an earlier time period. So I want you to picture for a moment George Washington and his wife Martha. Now that takes us back to the end of the 18th century, to the end of the 1700s. And I'll let our youngest members start. Brian, can you remember anything about what George Washington looked like? Anything about how he dressed or looked?
All I know his hair was poofy.
Poofy, and what color?
White.
White. Even if it wasn't naturally white, did you know he powdered it or wore a white wig?
I knew he wore a wig.
Okay. Jason, do you remember anything else?
Just the hair.
Okay. Did he have a beard? Now we picture Abe Lincoln with a beard, but George Washington was clean shaven. Okay. Can anybody tell me anything about his clothing, his costume?
Breeches or knickers?
Breeches, knee pants. And what did he wear below the knee pants? Long white stockings. Tell me about his shoes.
Buckles.
Black leather, big silver buckles, right.
Were they a patent type leather?
Could have
Just
been.
shine.
Could have been.
I always think it was shine.
Yeah, I know.
It seems unfair. It seems that some people have some special information. Was anybody here around at that time?
No, we're just.
No, it's dressed pretty well. Just check.
No, but there are.
I really don't know anything, but his shoes on for
Are you serious? And we all know he had wooden teeth.
And he made his own toothbrushes.
This is where history is.
Oh, okay.
We got a something in life, right?
Anybody remember his hat?
It wasn't a tricorder, was it?
A tricorder.
Was it a
Okay.
Crossing the wall.
Switch to Martha.
Okay, Martha. Who's Martha?
Although not as likely to be a wig. It may have been, I don't know, but it wasn't the fashion. Now, in the case of George, remember, all of the men of his stature either powdered their hair or wore wigs. Long, pulled back, even a black bow on the, what we might
Down
call
his shoulders.
Yeah. If you remember, Thomas Jefferson was the radical. He didn't.
not work.
Or was only under great pressure that maybe he did it at times. But you see, Thomas Jefferson was younger than George Washington. He was the president after the turn of the century, and he was beginning to show the way of what was going to be happening in the 19th century. So back to Martha. Poofy hair. Dress long. That's a given.
But I always
Okay.
think she has slippers on.
I never
Mary
remember
Jane.
I never remember what she dressed for some reason.
For some reason, I think of like a Mary Jane. You know what I mean? The little strap and the little.
We have far fewer paintings
Yeah, I
of
remember.
Martha than we have of George. There were no photographs then, so everything is strictly from paintings or from word pictures. I think of her dressed for a ball in a very low-cut gown.
Right.
And if you remember, the dresses stuck out at the
Yeah,
sides.
right.
Those are called panniers. P-A-N-N-I-E-R-S. And of course, the low
Silk,
dress.
was it silk usually? Or-
Probably.
Yeah.
You
So there
certainly.
wasn't a bustle. It just went
No,
out
it
of
just
the
went on the
sides.
sides. It's weird.
There was help to do that. And I showed you some of the modifications of the structures. So we do know less about Martha. At least our mind's eye can picture less. Fewer paintings. So,
I think of Betsy Ross,
okay.
and she had kind of a little funny little hat that was kind of round and white.
Oh, yeah.
Like a cat, like a sleeping cat.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Okay. And this was commonly worn by all women in the house at that time. There is little of that still surviving by the end of the 19th
Why did
century.
they wear that in-house? Yeah, why did they good question?
Oh, to keep the hair clean,
Uh-huh.
because of course they were working around a fireplace, or the home was heated with the fireplace, so There was a lot more soot in the home, but also to keep in pure thoughts.
Really?
Isn't that nice? You know, the white hat will keep in pure thoughts, while black would have been worn in mourning.
Well, and that's a religious thing, because they all, women covered their heads. I mean, that was out of.
Here,
Well, but they didn't when they went to the upper class. Did not in very, like the ball that I was picturing for
But that's
Martha.
a carryover too with their religious.
Yeah, maybe some religions would.
well,
bend
some
the ball.
religions still do, like the Amish still,
Yep, right.
the women still cover
Yeah,
their
and
heads.
that's.
Okay, now another mental picture, still at the turn of the century. We go a few hundred miles southwest from New York City, which was then the capital of this brand new country. We find a man whose family is living in North Carolina. He feeds them primarily by hunting, and it's getting harder and harder to do the hunting that he wants to do. So he's going over the Cumberland Gap into an area that will soon be known as Kentucky. His name is Daniel Boone. Now tell me what Daniel Boone is wearing.
Coonskin,
Coonskin, maybe. Davy Crockett, for sure, we think of in the coonskin hat. How long are Daniel Boone's trousers, pants?
Over down, they just know the
They're probably long.
Yeah, long.
And I think of
Do his
leather.
shoes?
But he
Well,
had high
I think
boots.
Do his shoes have silver buckles?
No.
Probably high
They're
boots
more
or
like-
possibly Indian moccasins. A lot of what we may think of as originally Indian clothing is adopted by many of the frontier men. There's the spread. Upper social economic level, not quite so high up on the scale. Even at the time of George Washington and in New York City, the working man was more inclined to wear long pants for protection, for all kinds of reasons. It was the stylish, it was the fashion to wear the short pants. Okay, between these pictures at the turn of the century and our clothing of the 1880s, we have a lot of technological changes. And again, a carryover from what Elizabeth Nozick was telling us as we talked about the foods. And Denny told you the same thing in understanding the history of Boulder and the agricultural implements. You kind of need a timeline of some of the things that are changing. So at the turn of the century, George's clothing had to be made from one of four things, the four natural fibers. He could wear wool, he could wear silk, he could and did wear linen. He probably wore very little cotton. While it was a natural fiber, it was very hard to turn into fabric because of getting those pesky seeds out. But, you know, just before the turn of the century, Eli Whitney discovered the cotton gin. And as that went into greater production, it allowed the southern plantation owners to produce more cotton. The mills in the north had learned, early stages of the Industrial Revolution, to harness water power to run looms. And they were very willing to weave at a far faster rate than one individual weaver could do. And they wanted cotton. So plantation owners say, by golly, I'll get you more cotton. Of course, that meant more slaves. And we see the whole beginning, well, it certainly wasn't the beginning, but we see a definite growth of the tension between North and South over the slavery issue. And it's all because the northern factories want what the southern plantation owners can produce. So cotton was not big in 1800. It was increasingly big by 1840. It was very big and very available soon after the war. It was the Civil War. It was an important part of economic reconstruction for the South to again produce that cotton. So we have mills able to weave it. It takes them longer to figure out how to commercially spin it on a larger scale. We have sewing machines invented in the 1840s. Now, the first ones weren't very practical. You had to sit there and crank them by hand. But the whole concept of taking handwork that needed to be on the top and the bottom of the fabric and figuring out how to make a machine do it was quite a marvel. By the 1850s, those sewing machines were far more practical. Mr. Singer invented almost nothing. He made slight modifications on Elias Howe's sewing machine, but he was a master at selling it. And we have an increasing number of things that will be important to us because somebody had a knack at marketing and advertising. That was carried out by the growing number of newspapers, by magazines, and those items were distributed by means of a post office and the railroad. And by 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete through Cheyenne, so that any of this mail, any of these magazines that you wanted to subscribe to could be brought west, at least as far as Cheyenne. Then by 1872, there was train on down into Denver, a spur into Boulder. All you had to do was wait for the mailman to bring you your goodies. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Walker up at Walker Ranch would not have had mail delivery at home, but they'd hold it for them in town at the store until they could get into town to pick it up. The Civil War is both a disruption to life in the 19th century, and as with many military things, it was a push for new changes. Elizabeth mentioned that canning, preserving of food, came from military needs in France. Well, in the 19th century in America, we have these northern looms spitting out many yards of good fabric. We have sewing machines in rows being the beginnings of factories, and they produce the uniforms for the northern soldiers. And the men went home with the realization that, gee, ready-made clothes aren't all that bad. You know, those machines can make it, and it's a whole lot easier. It doesn't take near as long as for my wife to make it. He also went home with an appreciation of canned food and coffee, and those things continued to be important in his life. On the other end of it, not only do we have soldiers getting accustomed to having a machine having produced their clothing, we have some genius thinking, I'm going to keep track of the sizes that we make for these guys, because they were all measured and custom made. There was no concept of standard sizes. But by the end of the war, they had realized, by golly, a few limited waist measurements and a few limited length measurements pretty well takes care of their pant needs. The shirts, we make them big enough, most anybody can wear them. So we have the beginning of standard sizes, at least for men. Takes a little longer after the 1860s to have the same information for women, but it comes fairly quickly. We also, by the time of the Civil War, just kind of as a marking point, approximately mid-century, we have shoes that have a distinct left and right foot. Voila! Can you imagine how much more comfortable they are?
It's hard to believe that this was
that it took that long.
That's a long time.
Sewing machines were very quickly adapted to heavier sewing machines to help in the making of shoes. So that too no longer had to be a handmade operation. After the war, in the early 70s, we have some Yankee entrepreneurs who realize that even though factories can now make a lot of clothing, the wife at home is still doing a lot of it. And wouldn't it be nice if it was easier? And they made paper patterns. Rather than having to cut apart an old dress or carefully pick it apart, and using that as your pattern to cut out the new dress, which kind of meant you always wore the same style, you could now have a paper pattern with the latest fashion. Women at home could use it, dressmakers could use it, so that even in little, very rural, very isolated Boulder, it was possible to have, if not the newest French fashion, at least last year's. You know, it was
We're
pretty
still that
current.
way.
Right.
East Coast, West Coast, blind and deaf.
You're right.
Well,
later.
But there is the feeling that, okay, well, what are they doing, you know, out
Yeah.
there on the frontier? By the 1880s, the frontier is not that isolated from the rest of the nation. If you had the money, if you had the desire, you could have most anything you wanted. It's up to us to decide what they wanted, what they could afford, and really what they had.
So when did Sears Roebuck?
Montgomery Ward was the first. He was delayed a year by the fire in Chicago. So can anybody help me out? I think the fire was 72 and 73 was Ward's first catalog. It was one page. And then Ann Denny showed you the little tiny book that was Montgomery Ward's third catalog from 1875. By the way, the origin of Monkey Ward was when the local shopkeeper realized that he was losing business to the mail order catalogs. There was a major smear campaign to discourage the use of mail order catalogs. Then Sears.
Were they questioning his parentage?
They were questioning his quality.
Oh.
They were saying you're a fool to send your money away for something sight unseen, even if you've seen a picture. Sears was kind of a copycat from Montgomery Ward, and he was a watch salesman. And when he hired Roebuck to help, when he moved to Chicago was when he really got big time into the mail order catalog. But other stores also did catalogs. In fact, there's one out on the table. It's Bloomingdale's from New York City. Then, as now, it is not aimed at the lowest income levels. But they did produce a catalog that was available and admittedly aimed at the small city but fairly upper crust urban woman.
So when did Bloomingdale start? 1870s too?
Oh,
Later?
no, I'm sure it was older than that.
Oh, older than that?
In that with Bloomingdale's having the catalog, which happens to be dated 1886. I can't tell you how old they were. In Denver, we have Dangles and Fisher.
The building's
The
still named
DF from Mays DNF before it became Foley's. They would run their ads in the Sunday paper and ship their items to far off Boulder if you wanted to order something. So that gives you, I hope, a sense of what was possible. Oh, I forgot one major item that was happening during this time. Coal, of course, had been used for heat for quite some time. Gas had been used. That gooey black stuff was discovered coming out of the ground in Pennsylvania. It was the beginning of the petrochemical industry when they identified it as oil and when they started figuring out what can we do with it. And one of the things that they found that they could do with it was produce better dyes. So George Washington and Martha's clothes were dyed from natural materials. By the 1870s, we had quite an array of chemical-based dyes, aniline dyes, that allowed brighter colors, stronger colors. They dyed the material real well. They weren't terribly color fast, but at least for starters, you could have a nice range of colors. So now I'm going to show you, thanks to the collection here at the museum, some of what people might have been wearing. And I'm going to start with the fellas. And as you might expect, we kind of need to get dressed then as now from the inside out. So here could be an example of his drawers. Now please notice they are buttoned in the front. There's a tie in the back.
Band, yeah.
There is no elastic. Elastic had been discovered, but it was very little used in clothing, and I'm still guessing as to why. I suspect it didn't hold its stretch very long. You know, I think it died pretty easily. The length of these is well down onto the calf. If you wonder why, think about wearing wool pants.
Was this worn next to the skin?
This was worn next to the skin. This was a layer that, if you had to, you did without, which occasionally caused some problems. This item is, I'll mention one in particular. This particular item is a reproduction. In fact, I put it together a year or two ago from a pattern that is authentic from the latter half of the century. To the best of my knowledge, there are no men's drawers in the museum collection. I think we can understand that if you wonder whether your husband would care to donate his. The brown is not all that atypical in that here we have these beautifully dyed fabrics losing their color, so why put on white? Why put on something that is going to be harder to keep clean? And men, at least, tended to be more practical in that area. Okay, after it gets on his drawers, and I'm really not sure how likely anything like an undershirt was. Knitwear was coming in to be used in thermal underwear, but whether it was considered more or less essential to always have on an undershirt, I'm not sure. This is a typical man's more dress shirt. Yes, it's cotton. Notice the little band around the collar, or instead of a collar. You see there's no collar at all, and a very stiff front. Now in later years, this stiff front was made detachable. You could button it down so that you could use the stiff front with a softer shirt on underneath, and you just hope the button didn't give way, allowing the thing to flip up in your face.
Wear the shirt 3 days and the new front every day.
So that's big. Yeah.
Well, or the other way around, you could wear the front several
Like a bib.
days
Yeah.
with a fresh shirt.
Sloppy you were.
Yeah,
Right.
it makes it feel like a bib.
The reason for the collar band, I'm going to run out of what I want to do with things. Or the band, instead of a collar, was then topped by removable collars. These collars and cuffs are linen, are very stiff, are buttoned onto this shirt. In later years, possibly by the 1880s, but for sure by the 1890s, celluloid, forerunner of plastics, would make these collars, and rather than having to wear them and actually dispose of them, the celluloid was a little more worshipful.
So those are disposable, Margaret? I mean, they wore them a certain period of time and they were trash? No, not
Yeah,
really.
yes,
Really?
and in fact, if you could afford it, you'd only wear it once. I mean, they got ring around the collar too.
Yeah. It's expensive, absolutely.
Now, before the Civil War, this drop from panel was typical on men's pants.
It's like sailor
Maybe
pants.
Yeah, it's maybe.
Right,
yeah, maybe.
right, but, and that's, of course, what these are, especially if you saw the buttons. But, and then for adjustment in size by lacing up the back. But to appreciate the change, remember the fall. Now, this is a broad fall. There were pants in the early part of the 19th century that were only about this wide for the fall portion. By the 1880s, they had advanced to a fly. With buttons. The zipper was not invented yet. When it was, it had a annoying characteristic or quality of coming apart when you didn't want it to. It basically was after the First World War, before the zipper really had been improved enough to be practical and used. So in the 1880s, the pants did have a fly, and therefore for outward appearance looked very much like modern pants, but it would have been a button fly. Notice the buttons at the waistband,
Suspenders.
suspenders,
Yeah.
or what were still called braces.
Braces.
So suspenders there, and notice the absence of belt loops. Even the gunslinger put on his belt and his holsters, and it just sunk to his hips. There were no belt loops for them yet. These pants actually are from the 1890s or later. You can tell by the center crease. A crease was not considered appropriate yet in the 1880s. Notice the little belt on the back. Those of you that are ancient like I may remember this as a fad item in the 1950s. You know, are you going steady or aren't you? But then it was a desired adjustment. Remembering that clothing came in fairly standard sizes unless you could afford to have it custom made. And so that was one of the ways that it was a little more adjustable.
I had a suit made for me in East Africa back in the 1970s, and that button front the same way.
Well, you can buy jeans too. A lot of people don't like them.
Okay, well these would be dress pants because this is a good black wool. Or it could have been pretty much working clothes too in the wool slacks. They also used corduroy. Blue jeans were a possibility by the 1880s. Levi Strauss went to California towards the beginning of the gold rush. He turned his tent canvas into pants at the request of the miners who said they wore out their pants so quickly. And in 1873, he received a letter from a man in Utah saying, you know, I've been doing something to your pants that the miners out here really like. I don't have the money to develop it, but if you like the idea of using rivets, I'll show you how it's done and you can patent it and use it. So that was the beginning of the rivets for Levi Strauss. And all of the strain points, the top and bottom of the pockets, and the bottom of the fly. Until the miners pointed out that squatting in front of a campfire without aid of the underwear could sometimes be uncomfortable. And Levi Strauss removed that particular rivet. We think of black for the Victorian era.
Yeah, we do feel a lot, yeah.
Lots of reasons for that. Of course, Queen Victoria was widowed very young and remained in widow's black throughout the rest of her life, some 40 or 50 years. So it was very in vogue to wear black. But also, all of her photographs are black and white. We can't always tell what color they were really wearing. Well, this is a man's vest, and not at all the most flamboyant of the men's vests. A beautiful tapestry. Colors were worn by men in the 1880s.
That was machine gun, right, Margaret? That was machine gun.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. To finish dressing for the businessman in town, he would, of course, have put on a solid black vest. He would have put on his black coat, complete with
She was wearing like a...
there's something of a waistband here, not all the way around. The coat is still quite long.
Is that wool or is it
Yes.
vinyl?
This is wool. There is a satin lapel. The not quite so well-to-do man, less prestigious, the lower clerks in the stores as opposed to the owner of the store, was wearing a style called a sack coat that looked quite a little like our suit coats of today, except that it was a shorter V-neck and buttoned very high. There might only have been 3 buttons on the coat, but the top one is the one that was buttoned, and it was quite high up on the chest as compared to how the coats would be buttoned today. The vest that I showed, let me see about this vest. White lining. Anybody have any ideas why they do this beautiful wool vest and put a white muslin type lining in it?
Maybe with an inch or something?
You never took it off.
There's
white
more.
shirt.
More than an inch of lining?
Protecting the white shirt from the colors in the wool, as well as comfort.
You know, it's interesting, I guess, in terms of that vest, it still has that little adjustment on the back. And that, you see those in even modern vests, that
Oh,
same.
yeah.
Yeah, oh, yeah,
thing,
little
to adjust, yeah.
Mhm.
More style, I guess, now than
So it
maybe
can be
funky,
tanned.
but, yeah.
The man could have had any number of overcoat styles, double-breasted, single-breasted, some with cape, some very long. But the most interesting coat, I feel, that the museum has in their collection from our time period weighs a ton.
Oilcloth.
Oh, that's incredible.
This is a fish brand type coat. It has been shellacked and oiled for waterproofness. Now, rubber was known.
Incredible. Isn't it?
Notice how it's sticking together. See the cut in the back? So you can be riding the horse. This will protect both you and your saddle.
Oh, that's incredible. That's an original, right, Margaret?
This is an original.
What's the materials for that?
It's a cotton canvas that has been oiled and shellacked for its waterproofness. Now, they had bonded rubber to fabric. I can only think it wasn't very successful yet because it wasn't widespread. But they did have the beginnings of what would become our more normal raincoat and galoshes.
Were they wearing the slickers? Because I thought they've been worn for a long, long time in the West, the slickers, but that's after this period. The slickers?
Well, what are you thinking of to have made the slicker?
You think it was out of that material there to make the slicker?
It could have been.
I see.
It could have been. Okay. We've got our man fairly well dressed now. There are some interesting shoes back here on display and boots so far as the button top shoe. The top hat was still worn by some, but a newer and increasingly acceptable style was the rounded, either bowler or derby style of hat. As with many of the styles in this country, it started in England and came across England and France. not have gone outdoors without something on his head. For sure. What were the kids wearing?
Caps.
How would you like
Oh,
to
look
keep
at
her
that.
in
Love
this?
Adorable.
It's like a christening
Yeah,
gown.
doesn't
It probably is a christening
Beautiful.
gown, but the length is not all that different from what all babies would have been kept in, at least until they were getting around some. Notice all of the lace,
Beautiful.
the tucks. The best way I can explain what happened to clothing fashions in the 1870s and 80s is that for every minute of time the sewing machine saved, they put some fancier gizmo to take more targets. Because there's no way all of these little tucks
By hand.
would have been done by hand unless the basic sewing could have been done by machine, and these were probably done by
So
machine
that's a
as
baby's
well.
dress?
Yes.
This is a baby's
So
dress.
Boy
So-
and girl.
Boy,
Boy or girl, you're sick.
Right.
But it's
The
such a
babies
long
were like
dress.
taller
It's
than
just-
you.
Yeah, right. That's it. It's very long.
when sleeping, it was doubled back underneath them as a way of helping to keep them warm.
Was there any function to that, or was it purely style? The
It
length?
was mostly style, but as I say, by having the extra length, you were able to double it under at least a sleeping child for a little more warmth and coverage.
Easy to walk in.
That's right.
Taller baby.
Okay, it's already been mentioned that boys and girls would have worn that dress as an infant. Boys and girls might have worn this dress.
Boys do.
Boys. We know for certain that this is a boy's
And the
dress.
boys are red.
Wow.
I'll have one of these gentlemen try it on.
Complete with the pink and white collar. This, boys would have been in dresses until approximately school age.
I have a picture of my father. He was born 1892. And I have a picture of him, his first day of school, and it was the first time he had on pants.
Wow.
Well, and those were, I'm sure,
They were
knee pants,
knickers.
because as late as the
High top
1920s, the boys can remember, my father, who was born in the 20s, can remember getting his first long pants, which would have been maybe at the age of 9 or 10, having worn the knickers the first few years of school.
And his hair was long too, I might add.
In addition to the beautiful silks and wools that would have been used in clothing, at the other end of the extreme are the miners who didn't have underwear on underneath their jeans, and the families who, even if they were eating well, and they might not have been, did not have surplus crops to barter or to be able to outright sell to have cash to buy this new material at the store. And your feed and your seeds came in cotton bags, and certainly in the latter part of the 19th century and well through the Depression era of the 20th century, people can remember garments being made from feed bags, flour sacks.
They even put patterns on them sometimes, didn't they?
Yeah.
Sure, these are typical, although I think in the 20th century we start seeing some nice little flowers and some of that type of thing that made it a little easier, but even when it was printed as a feed sack, rather than in any decorative way, this might be the only way to get a new shirt for a growing boy. And even more underwear might have been made from such things. Okay, now we're going to dress the woman. When she gets up in the morning, she's probably wearing a nightdress or a nightshirt. And her husband would have been too. His just would have been a little more plain without all of the lace and eyelet and the like. By the way, the eyelet was being machine made and you could buy it at the store. Ruffled laces were being made that way, riprap. Quite a few of the trends that we know today were in existence by the 1880s.
It would take a while to button that thing up.
Yeah, for sure.
Would it have been floor length? Long?
At least well below the knee. I don't know if it was clear floor length. Milady would have slipped on her chemise. Now this is cotton, or it might still be linen, but for most people it had now switched to a fine cotton. Again, lots of lace. Sometimes the chemise had little short sleeves. This would be approximately knee length. There's a little extra fullness in the back. We're all getting some of the fullness that she's going to need in her outerwear, plus maybe some adjustment for size.
Anything more under this? Or is
No,
this-
no,
this is-
this would have been next to the, well, underneath part of it. In the upper part of the body, this was the first part. In the lower part of the body, she too would have drawers.
Aren't they
A
cute?
A smooth waistband, slightly gathered below that,
Open crotch.
open crotch. Keep this in mind, my dears, when you have your long dress,
That's true, you're in a
your
hurry. You're in a hurry.
petticoat, your apron on, and you attempt to use the outhouse. And we're only going to be wearing one petticoat. Again, we have tufts and lace. The garment that never should be seen is still decorated. On top of the chemise.
We're gonna make you put one on.
Just wait.
We're gonna dress you in
Make sure he gets one of those.
and we're gonna cinch you in too. That coat was made for you.
That's right. Of course it is.
On top of the chemise would go the corset. The metal bust that fastens down the front was common by the 1880s. It's also laced up the back. But compared to an earlier era, you no longer had to have somebody help you dress every time now because of the metal fastener in front. By having someone, possibly even your husband, lace you into it the first time you put on the new garment, then the adjustment that you needed for size had been done and you could dress yourself.
Everybody wore for, oh,
Everyone.
Or not.
It certainly was the style. But now notice all the stays.
Skinny women wore corsets, you think, too. It had nothing to do with weight,
Oh, I
right?
had none
Correct.
of weight.
This is a below the waist style in that if you look closely, the waist is towards the middle of this. In fact, I've got it upside down because here are the spreads for the hip, and here are the bust cups of sorts. So this is approximately the waist. Now, if you have,
Pioneer women have worn this?
well, you decide.
Going to town,
With
they
it
probably.
coming down well below the waist, they cannot bend.
Yeah.
They cannot bend over. They must stoop. Did they work in the garden?
Yeah.
Did they pick up the baby?
Of course, all that activity.
Before they used steel stays, they used whalebone stays. They broke. Some women had severe puncture wounds and maybe worse. On top of the, I'm not completely getting away from corsets, but on top of the drawers and chemise and below the corset, we get our first petticoat, and this is the full waist.
That is a waist of a woman.
I mean,
Yes.
you know, obviously it's half of it. It's front and back, but this is not folded in quarters. This is it. Corsets are measured inches, and I'll bet that baby's waist is darn close to 18
They were
inches.
going skinny.
I mean,
They
even
put 'em in
3 and
for men.
4-year-old children today have waists far more
Even
than
that.
18
Yeah.
inches. Now, to achieve this,
You just didn't like
Or
the
the
picture.
waist.
you put on a corset by the time you started to school. If you were in the upper classes where this is important. Now, this little wrapper does not have any stays in it. It might have been almost as much to keep the little girl warm as to begin to shape her body. But the literature of the 1870s and 80s definitely point out that you could have surgery without aid of anesthetic to remove some of your lower ribs, to help the corset give you a fashionable 18-inch waist.
I thought now was like today. Yeah.
Did everybody do this? Of course not. Did everybody wear a corset? Of course not. If they couldn't buy an outer garment, did they buy a corset? You can read diaries of girls working, saving their pennies to be able to buy the coveted corset, which she may or may not be able to wear after she gets it. This was a period of time of great upward mobility. You wanted to look like you had more money and more wherewithal than you had. What's different? And clothing was a first-class way of doing it.
Still is.
So if you were a young woman wanting to attract a man of the upper classes, you might go to quite great extremes. Was it common? Did Mrs. Walker wear a corset? I can't tell you. We have to use some common sense and some thinking about it. It's quite probable that if she wanted to wear the corset and the really very tight clothing that was the style when she went into town and when she went to church, she tried to wear it every day because your body relaxes if it gets out of all that constraint. I have had a woman, a living history interpreter, who wears the corset when she is at her full-time job of living history interpretation, that is her summer job, say that she never has a backache when she's wearing the corset. I mean, it was the original back support and waist cincher. At the same time, she has trouble catching her breath and various other things
How about
when she
eating?
has it on.
How about eating?
Circulation problem.
But you don't eat as much either.
No, it's true.
Maybe they
Right.
started
Right.
grazing then with lots of little meals. I can't give you an answer. We know that the fashion said they wore the corset. We know that some women most certainly wore the corset all the time, and I even wonder if maybe the bed. But we certainly can't tell you that everybody did, and that's going to have to be your reading, your research, your thought about what those women were like. So after we get on at least some petticoats,
She had
Skinny.
stockings on and garters.
She would look like that. She weren't.
she would have had stockings, and yes, they'd go on next to the skin. They weren't necessarily long stockings. You know, they may have only come to the knee or something because, of course, the woman has all of her garments going clear to the ground. The stockings would have been silk for dress, but would have been cotton and wool for
How did they stay up longer if they didn't use elastic?
They had knit that would have some stretch, you know, just as your sweater stretch a little bit.
My grandmother, they would just knot them.
Yeah, roll them and knot them. Or take a string and then roll them over it. You know, tie the string.
Well, before the Civil War, they were wearing 6 and more petticoats. Can you imagine how heavy they got?
Oh my God.
So the huge hoop of the 1860s was considered an absolute miracle because you could get away with fewer petticoats and still have the desired silhouette, the great big round shape, because you put on a wire, a metal hoop. Now, you might have some problems when the wind came along and lifted the whole thing. This is a relatively narrow hoop, what we would have seen in the 1870s and 80s, when the styles could be very, very tight on the legs, but still to help hold the weight of the garment out from the legs. Another advantage to them, not only could you get by with fewer petticoats, you've got that little hole you can walk in. You'll find out that the long skirts have a tendency to wrap around your legs, and you could walk within this little cage. Depending on the style of your dress, you might also want some help with a bustle. Now, some bustles were simply little pads. I don't know why they needed any padding, but I suppose if I had an 18-inch waist, maybe I'd need some too. This is adjustable. You see it can stick out more or less. And it's very healthy because it's supported by the shoulders rather than just being tacked onto the waist. And this was a big thing that they were pushing in the women's magazines. All of this weight put on the hips was not good for you, to attach everything possible, button on the petticoats to your chemise or to an upper layer so that your shoulders are supporting more of the weight. On top of the corset, she would have put a corset cover. It could have been very lovely cotton and lace, or here is a hand crocheted corset cover. There would have been a drawstring around the neck to have pulled this up to size. We're still in the underwear.
That's unbelievable.
She's going to finally get a dress into. A lot of the styles of the 1880s, a lot of the high fashion are two-piece. We have a skirt.
So more two-piece than dresses, you're saying, Doris? I mean, Margaret at that time? More
The high fashion
high fashion,
was
okay.
frequently two-piece because we have a slim front with all of the pleats at the bottom. We have fullness in the back, and this is not the most extreme from the 1880s. I couldn't find the dress I really wanted. What's this fabric?
Is that cotton, Margaret? Or is that?
No, it's probably a wool,
Yeah.
but quite fine. This is the top, and you see the tops came down over the top part of the skirt, again allowing for the bustle, the fullness in the back. I've drawn a blank on the name for this style that's pulled back, and we have some of them. Maybe it'll come to it.
You can't move your arms forward, but you can do that.
Yes, the sleeves, as those of you that were with us on Saturday have noticed, the sleeves were very tight.
Why is that?
It was improper to raise your hands or reach forward. So you
they
could
kept
only
you,
reach
but that's
this
why
way.
they kept you in.
Yeah, this was the beautiful look.
They're
Not putting your hands
Like a little dog. Well, it's sort of like ballet if you think about
Right,
it.
first
There's a lot of literature that will point out the extent to which clothing was designed and accepted by women to limit them,
Yeah.
because if they were limited in their movements, they clearly had help to do the work. They were displaying their husband's wealth, or their pretense of wealth anyhow, so that the fashion didn't have to be functional. because that's what you wore when you went out or when you were expecting guests. You might wear a wrapper similar to this at home, what we would call a house coat. How many women wore it as a dress? It's styled very much like one of our dresses. Those of you who tried on the dress with the little inner vest, here it is. This is authentic from the 19th century. When she went outdoors,
Oh, wow, they're showing
she might have put on a cape of this sort, lots of fringe, jet beads, obviously a dress cape. The everyday cape would have been of wool or corduroy.
Would it ever have been like out of an oilcloth on the frontier itself?
Probably, and
For the rain weather?
I'm inclined to think that almost anything you can imagine somebody did. It all depends whether you wanted to appear to be in high fashion or not.
Probably not that much distinction in many cases between men and women's dress in the frontier.
So far as what was available, it certainly could be adjusted. There certainly were women who thought, that looks like a pretty good deal to me. I'm going to adopt men's clothing. In the display case is Martha Maxwell's bloomer outfit. This is an authentic. It was actually the property, possession of Martha Maxwell. The bloomers were, of course, full trousers and what is described as a short tunic, but it was still below knee length. So I don't know how much freedom they really gained with it. Going out for a stroll or for a ride, she would have taken her parasol. They continued to shrink in size, and that, of course, meant they were more and more just for decoration rather than for any real use.
Oh, shoot, those boots.
That are so
The button shoe.
You had to have the shoes.
Imagine putting this shoe on your child and needing to help them. If you've never used a button hook, you might try doing
Yeah,
some
that's
of that.
incredible. So this is a child shoe. This is a child? No.
No, that probably is that would be a woman's shoe, but the children would have worn the same.
Incredible.
They did have lace shoes by then, but the button was by far the most common.
So small.
If my lady was going any place in public, she probably took her fan. Look at this beautiful wood fan. She most certainly would have put on a hat. She probably wore her hair pulled up, and the little hats kind of perched on the back. There's two different styles of hats. And there was another hat that unfortunately, if the museum has, I couldn't find. It's described in your manual as the inverted flower pot. And indeed, that was the shape of it, straw or felt, decorated with everything from feathers to whole birds, flowers, highly decorated. I almost forgot my paper dolls tonight. And I like them because they give a better picture than this dress can without all the proper undergarments of the shape of clothing and some of the colors that were possible. We know about the colors because of some of the things that actually survived and because of factory information. Wendy, are you sorry? Now the long train on the dresses is 1870s. The bustles were big in the 1870s, and the train, including here on the frontier, can you imagine a train out behind your dress, walking on dirt streets and wooden sidewalks? Right? The bustle disappeared for for a few years. It came back in a great vengeance in the 1880s. At its most extreme, it stuck out at a 90-degree angle, a full foot. By 1890, the bustle was gone. Hopefully for good.
Never know, things come back.
You know about
more men
Yeah, you know about fashions.
Right.
In the late 1880s, the sleeve that had been so very tight began to have fullness at the top, and by 1895 it had exploded into that huge leg of mutton sleeve that you see on the Gibson girls.
Yeah.
Skirts and blouses, or what were called waists, were sometimes used in the 1880s, but they were not really big until the 1890s. I know we're out of time. I know we're running late.
Well, what made the 1890s gay?
That's right, the 1890s. Before the crash, wasn't there that crash, some crash?
Well, that's the 1920s.
Well, there 1893 there was one too, but I can't imagine that made them gay.
I thought there was some crash or something.
There
Silver
was,
crash,
1893.
wasn't there some silver?
It wouldn't make it gay.
Well, yeah,
Well, no, days just before or something
Oh,
like that. You know what I'm saying?
Oh.
That it's a call before the storm.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah, I think
I did read somewhere
Let's
where
get some
the
silver
1890s it was fashionable to put laudanum in your tea in small amounts of
Well,
laudanum.
is that what made them gay?
Well, what they have laudanum in
It's like a tranquilizer.
Well,
It's a
it's two things, and it's speed and something else. Opium?
What was it? No,
I forget what, it's a combination, and that was,
opium was considered reasonably okay to use to help whiten the skin.
I thought strychnine. Strychnine or something.
Oh, they used all kinds of things, and I really haven't studied very much of the cosmetics and the beauty items. There's a little book out on the table that I've purchased, and I was reading a little bit of it this evening just before you got here. It's a delight. Do you know that the line under your eye is not just because you were up too late last night, but because you were overexcited?
Oh, no, I didn't know that. Margaret, you're awfully all overexcited people.
You know that when you get excited, a female, when she gets excited, her lips turn red. That's why we use lipstick.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Since the time of the Egyptians, to let the men.
Men know we're excited. Like peacock.
Put on the appearance of excitement. We really must close and let you get home this evening, but questions.
That was great. That was good. Margaret, very enjoyable.